my little bag of musical tricks just helped me out to tell me what song to end with. I was asked by the lovely Miss Geeta Sadie last year, or a couple years ago, to write a song for her film about free speech. And it's a really great film about the Sedition Act in Montana. Has anybody seen that? It was on PBS. Yeah, good, a lot of hands. It's a great film, check it out. And I was trying to figure out how to, she wanted just a song to end with, to roll with the credits. And I wrote something, and then I hated it, and I wrote something else, and I hated it, and then finally I realized, you know, free speech is so personal for me. I'm a songwriter, and I was trying to imagine what it would be like to live in a country where I couldn't just say whatever I wanted in my songs whenever I wanted to, and to me that would be sort of like hacking off a limb or two, and so that kind of helped me push through my little mental block, and I just wrote a song for me about what free speech means as a songwriter. And I don't think there's anybody in the country that we could say who's worked harder to protect free speech than Amy Goodman. So this is for Amy. I don't know much, I'm out of touch and full of fear. I'm living here in this land of strangers. I've got no plan, don't know who I am. Everything that I was is fading to dust. They say I am free, but all I can see is danger. Where would I be without a song to name me? A song to save me, a song to hold on to, a song to be known through. I need a song like I need bread and water. Where would I be without a song? I'm just like you, so confused and full of doubt. How can we figure it out if we can't talk about it? And we've been given a gift, someone else took the risk, made the sacrifice. It might have cost them their life, just so we could say what's on our minds today. So go and sing me a song to name ya, a song to save ya, a song to hold on to, and a song to be known through. I need a song like I need bread and water. Where would I be without a song? A song to name me, a song to save me, a song to hold on to, a song to be known through. I need a song like I need bread and water. Where would I be without a song? Thank you so much. Thanks to the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center for working on this for years and years and years. Here's Betsy from the Peace Center. Thank you.
This issue of Yes Magazine was on the newsstands 4 years ago when I took over as director of the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center. Amy Goodman brings uncensored news to radio and television media that set us free. And in the 4 years since that time, Democracy Now! And Amy Goodman have been regular names at the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, not only because we've spent that time and more trying to bring them here, but because Her articles and her interviews and her analysis of current events are the things that I put in the newsletter. They're the things that we rely on to tell us what's going on in the world, who's involved, and what can be done. Democracy Now! Is the largest media collaboration in North America in public broadcasting, and Amy Goodman has won most of the major prestigious awards in journalism. But you know that. Amy, everybody that heard that you were coming told me countless numbers of times what a jewel you are and how wonderful they think you are, how thankful they are to you, how very important you are to their understanding of the world. Bill Moyers says that Amy Goodman breaks the sound barrier. She goes where the silence is and breaks the sound barrier. We know that she asks the tough questions that people really don't want to give answers to, because she knows that it's important that we find that information out. Amy and her new book give us hope that there is a way to change the world. There is a way forward. Please join me in welcoming, finally, Amy Goodman to Missoula, Montana. Just a little bag of things from the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center to remember the Peace Center and her trip to Missoula. So I'm going to leave that with you. And then, sorry. We just had a couple of things to give to Amy to remember the Peace Center and her trip to Missoula and what we have here. So that's just a little gift bag for her.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And then the there's a woman on the Salish Kootenai Reservation that made this quilt for Amy.
Oh my gosh!
And she couldn't get down here, but she wanted me to present it to her as a way of saying thank you. The people on the reservation appreciate the information that you're giving them. They love you, and thank you for everything that you're doing. So this is called Harmony.
Thank you. That's absolutely beautiful. Oh my God, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. It's absolutely beautiful. Since I'm always cold, it's going to make a big difference, especially on these 70 cities that I'm traveling to. I would like to dedicate this talk to two wonderful women. First, my college roommate. It was freshman year when I got to college, and I don't think I would have made it through without her. She was a native Missoulian. She was ferociously funny, intensely intelligent, impossibly elegant, a masterful musician. She played the cello. Her name was Cynthia Louise Herbig. She was the daughter of Hal and Lois Herbig. And I carry her with me in my heart all of these years. And so to return to Missoula now, it is very deeply meaningful for me. Cindy was a wonderful, wonderful woman. And the second woman I dedicate this to is Jeanette Rankin. Wow, to be here with the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center means so much. She was the first woman ever elected to the United States Congress, a native of Missoula. In 1917, she joined a handful of other representatives in voting against entry into World War I, asserting, despite harsh criticism, that the first time the first woman had a chance to say no against war, she should say it. In 1941, she courageously stood alone in voting against entry into World War II, knowing full well it would cost her her congressional career. Still, her steadfast and lifelong opposition to war as a viable solution to international conflicts provoked questions regarding our basic assumptions about peace, war, and conflict, questions that now form the core of a global people's movement for a positive, sustainable future. Jeanette Rankin, she said, "I was born for peace." I originally come from Pacifica Radio. It was founded 60 years ago last week, on April 15th, 1949, in Berkeley, California. It was founded by a war resistor named Lou Hill, along with Richard Moore and Eleanor McKinney, a core of people that believed we needed a media outlet that was brought to you not by corporations that profit from war, but by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. Oh, and someone else was born soon after that, maybe not so soon. And that was one David Moore, who is a professor here at the University of Montana, teaches Native American Studies and English, and it is a great honor to be here at his school as well, the son of the founders of Pacifica Radio. So KPFA went on the air in 1949 on April 15th. And it didn't look very promising. See, FM was in its infancy, and it was an FM station. In order to even hear the station, you had to get a special radio called the subscriber. So you get this odd contraption, you turn it on, and what do you hear? People begging for money. This is not a very, auspicious beginning. But here we are 60 years later. It was the pioneer of listener-sponsored media. It was adopted by NPR, adopted by PBS, and now today, as newspapers are shuttered around the country, what is the new model that they're talking about? Nonprofit journalism. Nonprofit journalism profits us all. And I do believe it began with Pacifica Radio. So the first station was KPFA, 1949. The second station was KPFK in Los Angeles, 1959. The third station was my station in New York, WBAI, in 1960. Oh, the fifth station, WPFW in Washington, 1977. The fourth was KPFT in Houston. KPFT is an interesting station. It's the only radio station in the country. Well, in the first months of operation, it was blown up. Yes, the transmitter, well, the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter, and they blew it to smithereens. So then KPFT got back on its feet, built a new transmitter, and they blew it up again. Now, the silver lining of this is you could imagine that Pacifica Radio didn't have money for advertising, so it definitely exploded it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of Houston. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops. I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous simply because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, a Palestinian child, an Israeli mom, uncle from Afghanistan, an aunt from Iraq, a child in Missoula, New Mexico, on the border. I was just there yesterday, or was it the day before, Sunday morning, celebrating 15 years of the Border Books Festival with Denise Chavez, a remarkable writer who is the mother of this book festival. Whether it is a child in school, the Border Patrol, the immigration authorities coming to the child to say her parents have been taken. Whoever it is that's speaking, you get to hear them describing their own experiences in their own words. And that is what makes all the difference. You may not agree with them, as you don't agree with many members of your family. That is not the point. But you come to understand where they're coming from. And there's nothing more powerful. That begins to build bridges between communities, rather than advocating the bombing of bridges. The media can be a great force for peace in the world. Instead, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take it back. I want to go to the lead up to the invasion of Iraq and give you an example of how abused your public airwaves are. It's the 2 weeks around Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, giving his push for war at the UN on February 5th, 2003. You remember, it was the final nail in the coffin for the war, and I don't say that lightly. More than 1 million Iraqis have died, according to studies from Johns Hopkins University in Columbia and the British magazine, the medical journal, The Lancet. And the servicemen and women of this country, we're talking thousands, over 4,000. So let's look at the 2 weeks around that speech, the week before and the week after. The group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, did a study of the 4 major nightly newscasts: NBC Nightly News, ABC World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, and the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. There were 393 interviews done around war in that 2-week period. Guess how many were with anti-war leaders? 1 is an understatement. 2 is an understatement.
3.
Very good. 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media. That is an extreme media beating the drums for war. Because those who are opposed to war, those who are opposed to torture, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. You know, someone asked me the other day what I think of the mainstream media. I think it would be a good idea. It's so important that the media express the spectrum of opinion. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. Anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us and civilian society to have the discussions and debates and make the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. So the question is now, has the media improved? You know, you just watch the networks, and remember, they're not just private companies. Yes, they're private companies, but they are leasing the public airwaves. It's not just public radio and television that are using the public airwaves. All of them are. And they have a responsibility to bring out the full spectrum of opinion. They are a national treasure. They're the way we talk with each other, the way we learn about the world, the way the rest of the world learns about us. So it really matters. Think about what you get on all the networks. This small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. I think you deserve something better. You deserve to be heard. Now, I'm also really honored to be working with Fact or Fiction. As we travel the country, we support independent radio and television stations everywhere we go, and also independent bookstores. Don't forget, they are sanctuaries of dissent as well. So it is great to be here with them. You know, this is our third book together. I write the books with my brother, journalist David Goodman. And each time that we travel the country, we notice there are fewer and fewer independent bookstores, which is why it's so important to be there for them. Our second book, well, the first book is called The Exception to the Rulers. That's the motto of Democracy Now!, the exception to the rulers. That should be the motto of all the media. The second book is called Static. And the reason we call it that is in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still, all we get is ever more static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. When what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. By the way, a daily digest sign-up list is being passed around. If you'd like to sign up, you'll get our daily headlines every day, media alerts, and you can pass them on, forward them to friends, stories that interest you. That's how we get word out. How many of you listen to Democracy Now! How many of you watch Democracy Now! Do you watch on Missoula Public Access? Do you watch on, it's on every day, and you should. Do you watch on Dish Network, Free Speech TV, on Direct TV, Link TV? Do you go online at democracynow.org, where there we video and audio podcast. Also, our headlines are available in Spanish. And you can bring us to your community every which way. We're very excited tomorrow to be broadcasting from, well, Missoula PBS, the TV station here, public broadcasting. We'll bring up a truck that has an uplink and we'll broadcast to the world. And this has been wonderful all over the country. I was in a few days ago, East Tennessee at Johnson City, and that was amazing. We broadcast on the NPR station there in East Tennessee, and when folks asked for the show to be broadcast, the station eventually said, okay, we'll give it a try, not expecting much. Well, let's say the general manager introduced me last week when I had come there to speak. He said, having Democracy Now! On WETS, on WETS, it's East Tennessee State University, is like having Car Talk every day. It broke every record in fundraising they ever had, far beat Morning Edition and All Things Considered, to their great surprise. It builds a diverse audience, and an audience that gives, either in large amounts or small amounts. And that's why it's increasingly being picked up by NPR and PBS stations, because it brings out a diversity of voices. It's a grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international, investigative news hour. We began in 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting on a few dozen community radio stations. And then, right around September 11th, 2001, we expanded to one public access TV station in New York, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, because they had the cameras that were connected to the studio we were broadcasting from. I said, as long as it doesn't interrupt the sound, because radio was closest to my heart. They said, don't worry, we'll just turn on the cameras and we'll broadcast the radio show. Well, it just took off like wildfire. Then other public access stations were saying, can we run it? Then when it came to a community on public access, the radio station would say, can we run it? Then it was low power stations, community stations, and NPR stations started saying, can we run it? And PBS stations started saying, can we run it? And now it's broadcasting on close to 800 stations around the country. It is the largest public media collaboration in the country. We have a deep commitment to supporting all public media, whether it runs Democracy Now! Or not, because that is the model, I think, that is so critical in this country. Corporate-free, non-commercial media, and we all have to ensure that it not only survives, but thrives. So, has the media, the corporate media, gotten any better from the days of the invasion of Iraq when they got it so wrong? I don't think President Bush could have convinced everyone that there were weapons of mass destruction if he simply had a little megaphone on the steps of the White House. He would have convinced some people. But he had something far more powerful: the US press. More powerful than any bomb, more powerful than any missile. The media are the most powerful institutions on earth. And the governments deployed the media, which is why we have to take it back. The Pentagon's deployed the media, which is why we have to take it back. It's not good for the generals. It's not good for the soldiers. It's not good for a democratic society. We are not supposed to be a part of the government, but apart from the government. And that's what ensures, well, what did Thomas Jefferson say? If he had a choice of a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, what would he choose? The latter, he said. These are basic principles of how journalism works in a democratic society. It's the reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power, which is why it was, well, of grave concern to us as we covered the Democratic and Republican conventions. Maybe some of you saw our coverage. We expanded our coverage to 2 hours, and our coverage was called Breaking with Convention: War, Peace, and the Presidency, from the streets to the suites to the convention floor. We went to Denver, and we were there in force, the whole Democracy Now! Team. And then we flew to St. Paul for the Republican convention. Well, on the plane, well, Jon Stewart was there, so we had to go interview him. We caught up with him in baggage claim. We asked him a few questions, and then I got a text on my cell phone as I was interviewing him. And there weren't many people going to drag me away from that interview, but it said, a house is being raided in St. Paul. Eyewitness Video had just taken up residence there. They had just come in from New York, and they were prepared to cover what was happening during the Republican convention. Now, we knew Eyewitness Video. We come from New York. They are a collective of videographers who gather not only their own videotape, but they gather videotape taken by many, many people. You know, in New York in 2004 at the Republican convention, over 1,800 people were arrested, put in these toxic piers on the Hudson River, held for days without charge. Only after President Bush spoke were many of them released. It was very unusual, extremely disturbing, and hundreds of them have been acquitted and exonerated. A number of them have sued, and it's cost us millions of dollars. It's what happens when you illegally, when you wrongfully arrest people. When these cases go to court, well, Eyewitness Video gathers the videotape, and they're shown, and it exonerates the people who were protesting, or perhaps were just caught up, you know, going to get some sushi one night, and suddenly there is a police cordon and they find themselves in jail. Or someone went out shopping for groceries, you know, to bring home to her kids, and she's swept up and ends up on a pier in the Hudson River. But then what made the judges really mad was when the police would show videotape, and then Eyewitness Video would show the unedited videotape. So that's Eyewitness Video. And the New York police consulted with the Denver police, and then consulted with the Twin Cities police, Minneapolis and St. Paul, so they knew who they were. So there they were, just getting settled and planning to go out and document whatever was happening. And the police raided the house. When we got there, we were not allowed to even go across the street to the house. There was the police told us we had to stay across the street until the African-American family next door, the mother came out and said, "You got to see what I'm looking at in the backyard. You come through my house and you can go into my backyard and then you can take a look at what they're doing to them." So we all went back, and there they were. All of the Eyewitness Video Collective was in handcuffs, or all those who were in the house at that point, including our colleague Elizabeth Press, who'd worked with us for years. And they had said that first the federal authorities came. They had AR-15 automatic weapons. They had guns. They came into the house. She was afraid. She was filming that they'd mistake her camera for a gun. She put it on her head, and then they were going through their suitcases and their computers, and they took them outside, and that's where they were detaining them. And so, I knew the police respect private property, and so I asked if the property owner was there. An older gentleman was there in handcuffs, and I asked if I could come interview him, and he said yes, and I could come onto his property. And so I jumped the fence with our cameraman, Hani, and the police told us to move back. Hani said, "I can't, she will fire me." He said, "You understand, I'm only following orders." So once the cameras were there, once the microphone was there, all these people were released. They were detained for hours, but they were released. And that shows the power of the media focusing in the right direction. These people were the victims of a preemptive raid. That's what it's known as. And you know Tom Cruise's movie Minority Report, where he's arrested for pre-crimes? I don't usually recommend Tom Cruise movies, but this one is very good. So that was Saturday. Then came Monday, Labor Day, the beginning of the Republican convention. So it was a beautiful blue sky day, very warm. St. Paul City Hall, thousands of people turned out for a protest, about 10,000 people. And they were led by soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan, US soldiers who felt the war was wrong. Some active duty, many veterans, some wearing full uniform. They face great threat when they do this, great risk to the rest of their lives, to their careers. People like Aaron Watada, we write about him. He wasn't there then, but we have a chapter in Standing Up to the Madness, our latest book, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times. These soldiers who don't go looking for trouble, but when it comes to them, they stand up. He had signed up in the military. No one forced him to do it. But when he weighed this war, the Iraq War, he felt it was immoral and illegal. And he was the first officer to say no, because it wasn't only about himself. He felt he couldn't lead young men and women into a war he did not believe in. And so it was people like that who were marching. Thousands of people followed, civilians, of course, mainly, and they marched to the XL Center, the convention center. So that was the big peace protest in the morning. And then I went off to the convention floor because the convention was beginning, and I was interviewing delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. And then I got a call on my cell phone. It was Mike Burke, our senior producer, and he was calling to say, come quickly to 7th and Jackson. Sharif and Nicole are getting arrested, and I think they've been hurt. Sharif is our other senior producer, Sharif Abokadus. Nicole Salazar is our multimedia producer. I said, what do you mean? Well, I raced off the floor. I said they were bloodied. I was running with Rick Rowley, our cameraman for the conventions. He's a very brave journalist with Big Noise Films who spends a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're running down the street. We get to 7th and Jackson in St. Paul. It's a big old parking lot. The riot police have fully contained the area. We run up. I've got all my credentials on. I've been on the convention floor. Top security clearance credentials that allow us to interview presidents and vice presidents and delegates. So the conventions are around my neck. The credentials are around my neck. I run up to the police, and I quickly say, you can see I'm a credentialed reporter. I was just on the convention floor. 2 of my colleagues, also fully credentialed, have been arrested. We need to have them released immediately. Can I speak to your commanding officer? They ripped me through that line so fast. They pulled me through the line. They twisted my arms behind my back. They slapped those rigid plastic handcuffs on me. They pushed me up against the wall, and they pushed me on the ground. That was in a matter of a minute or so. I was saying, this is ridiculous. You know I'm a journalist. But I need to see Nicole and Sharif now, because I heard that they were hurt. I could not see Nicole anywhere. I did see Sharif across the parking lot. His arm was bleeding. He was standing with his hands behind his back. He was also handcuffed with his credentials clearly around his neck. I demanded to be brought to him. Finally, I was. We're standing next to each other, and I am saying loudly to the police officers, you see that we're credentialed reporters. You have to release us now. I couldn't point because I was in handcuffs, but at that point, the Secret Service came and ripped the credentials from around our necks. I was charged with misdemeanor interference with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer there. And so they take me off into the police wagon, into the van, and there was Nicole. Her face was bloodied. She had her credentials around her neck. Her hands were in handcuffs. She quickly told me what happened. She said that when I had gone off to the convention floor, I thought they were at the public access station digitizing tape, but they heard there was more protest downstairs. It was right outside of the window of St. Paul Neighborhood Network. They ran downstairs, and she had a camera. Sharif had the microphone. She started filming. She did not plan to film her own violent arrest, but that's exactly what happened. The riot police came at her very fast. She was trapped because there were parked cars behind her. As they're saying, on your face, she's shouting back, press, press. She's holding her press credential up, and she is filming at the same time with her other hand. They take her down fast. They take her down hard. Their boot or knee is in her back. Her face is in the ground, and inexplicably they're pulling on her leg, which means her face is getting bloodied. And the first thing they do is they pull the battery out of her camera. If you had any question about what they wanted to stop happening then. Sharif is next to her. He is very experienced. He is cool. He is calm. He was telling the police to calm down. They took him, threw him up against the wall, kicked him twice in the chest and the back, took him down, and they handcuffed him. So I was taken to the police garage where they had set up cages for the protesters. Sharif and Nicole were taken to jail. They faced PC felony riot charges. That's probable cause felony riot. Now, I didn't know it was happening outside. I just knew where I was. But what happened is that reporters put the video of our arrests online, and this was amazing what happened. I mean, it went viral immediately. It was the most watched video on YouTube for those first 2 days of the convention. The response was staggering. I don't know if they got hundreds or thousands of people calling in, emailing in, faxing in, tweeting in, whatever it was. It had quite an effect on the local authorities because we were soon released that night. And it's interesting, you know, more than 40 reporters were arrested that night, in those days. And Sharif was jailed with the AP photographer. The AP photographer was not released, but Sharif was because of that grassroots outcry. So that night, later that night, I had said to the police in the middle of all this as we were standing there, you know, they'd made the handcuffs so tight and it was cutting off my circulation. I said, can you at least loosen the handcuffs? So they tightened them. But later that night, I went off to the convention floor because some networks wanted to interview me. And I was describing what happened. I was in the NBC skybox, and an NBC reporter was right next to me. And he listened to what happened. He was doing a stand-up. And when the camera was turned off, he said, I don't understand. Why wasn't I arrested? And I said, were you outside covering the protests? And he said, no. I said, oh, well, I'm not being arrested in the skybox either. I mean, as Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. And this is actually a very serious point. You think of a lot of reporters who, they may be assigned to the inside, to the convention floor, and that's all their editors want, but you know, they see what's going on. They see people being clubbed, they see the tear gassing, and they know that this is a story too. Maybe they can get away by saying, well, there's color outside. I can bring in some color and then go into the convention. But if they're afraid that they will be arrested, that they won't be able to do the rest of their job, they're not going to go out there. And that is our job too. That is the problem, this chilling effect, because it's not only a violation of freedom of the press, it's a violation of your right to know. See, we have to cover We have to cover it all. We have to cover the orchestrated message from the convention floor. We got to get into those corporate suites and find out who's paying for all of this, these celebrations of democracy. You know, what corporation is paying for the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee? What corporation is paying for the Democratic Governors Association? Whatever it is, it's our job to find out. It's a basic principle of good journalism: follow the money. So I had many doors that were closed in my face at both conventions as I tried to get into these private suites. But that's our job too. And our job is to get out into the streets where people, those people who are not allowed in, well, what do they have to say too? Because democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all. We're not supposed to be a party to the parties. We're supposed to be out there covering the parties. Well, the next morning, the St. Paul police chief, John Harrington, held a news conference to talk about the success of the police operations. So, you know, I went over to cover it, of course, and the police officer who opened the door to the press conference happened to be my processing officer. So I said, you not only have to let me into this news conference, you have to let me out when it's over. So I went inside. There were more police and there were reporters, and we were asking questions, and I described what happened to Sharif and Nicole and me. And then I said, how do you expect us to operate in this environment? And what have you instructed the police to do? The police chief, John Harrington, said we could embed with the mobile field force. Embed with the mobile field force, the police. You know the model, embedding in the front lines of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Oh, is this the new model of how we cover American cities? Sure enough, the next day we saw Fox right in the middle, a guy with a baseball cap right in the middle of the riot police. He was embedded. I think the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low. I mean, I am not saying that the journalists who embed in the front lines of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan are not brave. They are. But if you are embedded with the troops, you are sleeping with them, you are eating with them, your lives are in their hands. How do you think you're going to cover them? You are looking at the world through the crosshairs of a gun. You are looking at the war from the trigger end. If you're going to do that, you need reporters embedded in Iraqi communities and Afghan hospitals, in the peace movement around the world, to convey the full effects of war. And the problem is not only embedding in the front lines of troops, the problem is also being embedded in the establishment in Washington. That is a problem as well. We write about the access of evil, that reporters enjoy the access, A-C-C-E-S-S, the access of evil. They trade truth for access. You know, can you get on that list that the president will call on you for the next news conference? How do you think you get on that list? If they can be confident that your question will not be too tough. It's called softball, lobbing the softball question. And it's a big problem, and it's not worth it. Politicians need journalists more than journalists need politicians. We have to be serious, we have to do our job. And that's what is threatened when you are too cozy with those in power. It's not a comfortable position that we occupy, but it is an absolutely essential one, because it's where we debate the key issues of the day, where everyone should be involved. Look what we are facing today: global warring, global warming, the global economic meltdown, the lack of health care in this country. I mean, 40 million, more than 40 million people do not have health insurance. More than 100 million people are underinsured in the most industrialized, most powerful country on earth. What defines national security but the health of a population, the health of the people of a country? You know, I at the beginning of this tour, flying from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I was sitting next to a military consultant. He was headed to the military town of Huntsville in Alabama, and we were having a long talk about everything, and we're talking about the economy. You know, Michigan is ground zero for the economy. You know, Detroit, the number of foreclosures, and the auto industry in a shambles. Chrysler and GM pay more for health care than they pay for steel. They pay more for health care than they pay for steel. They're talking about building factories in Canada because there they have single payer. Now, some of you might not know what single payer is, and that is completely reasonable given how little it's discussed in the US media. And yet in one form or another, how it is the major model in the Western world. How is it that we live in the most powerful country on earth, yet we are so insulated when it comes to getting information? Single payer, when the government provides the insurance or provides the health care overall, is the single payer, right? Canada has it, and they're all different forms of it, but one way or another. Now, you don't have to agree with that. You could feel that private health insurance is the way to go, that you have a good health insurance plan and you don't want that to be threatened. That's absolutely fine. But there has to be a robust debate. The place to do that is in the media, to just jostle about and really argue out all of the positions. And is that what's happening in this country? I mean, Chrysler and GM not only pay more for health care than they pay for steel, they can't compete with the foreign auto manufacturers because they don't have to pay for their workers' health care. They come from countries that carry that burden, that provide for their own populations. So the auto companies don't have to carry that. It's interesting when we're at a point in history where you have perhaps the US multinational corporations joining with mom and pop businesses who can't afford to pay their workers' health care either, and the traditional healthcare activists may all actually be on the same side. But would you know that if you watch the media? The group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, the same ones that looked at the lead up to the invasion of Iraq and the lack of debate on that, did a study of the 5 days or week before President Obama held the White House Healthcare Summit. Remember, 120 people gathered to look at every option, put it all on the table. It was March 5th. And they looked at that week leading up to it. There was not a major voice in the major national networks or major national newspapers for single payer, even though a number of polls indicate that is the favored option of the American people. Not a single voice. When it was raised at all in the media, it was raised by critics to be slammed down. Now, President Obama, when asked by John Conyers, who's the chair of the House Judiciary Commission, chair of the House Judiciary Committee, year after year has introduced a single-payer health plan. When Obama was meeting with the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, Conyers asked, "Can I come to the White House Healthcare Summit?" And he was told no. But there was such an outcry that they were forced to invite him. And then single-payer healthcare advocates were protesting, or just healthcare activists were said they'd protest outside anyway because 1 in 120 wasn't enough. And so then they decided they would allow in the head of PNHP, Physicians for National Health Plans. So it was 2 of 120. So then, okay, that's the Obama administration position. Actually, by the way, it's not. And if you listen to or watch Democracy Now! On a regular basis, you know we've played the tape of Barack Obama saying he supports single-payer health care unequivocally, but that was a few years ago. But anyway, the Obama administration, they can advocate what they want to advocate, but the media plays a different role, and that is to lay out the options, to have people debate them, the experts in your communities. I mean, your state is extremely important. I mean, Montana is Senator Baucus, who is the leading voice on health care in the country. What he says matters. Your voices should also weigh in. Your voices should be heard. And then we come to the best solution when people are hashing out the issues, a third way, a fourth way, a fifth way. But we all know there's a problem. How do we solve it? And it is not enough, obviously, to what happens in the media, you have an 8 or 9 second soundbite that can only reinforce the status quo, because the only thing you can say in that amount of time is something people will understand quickly, which is what has been repeated over and over again. For example, if you were to say Saddam Hussein is like Hitler, you're ready for prime time. Why? Everyone understands what you're saying. That took like 4 seconds. You don't have to say anything else. If you had something else to say, oh, maybe I think the Bush administration might be guilty of war crimes. Actually, that fits into the 8 seconds, but you sound a little crazy because you need to explain what you mean. What are war crimes? What are the Geneva Conventions? What are the Nuremberg Principles? But you don't have time for that. And then they say, not that it's a political edit that you're not invited on, but you're just not quite ready because you can't concisely say what it is in 7 or 8 seconds. So what you can say is you can repeat the status quo. But where has the status quo gotten us? These global crises is what the status quo has gotten us. I think what we need the media to do is bring us creative thinkers and activists and scholars and practitioners and communities who've been working on these issues for years, people who think outside the box. Think of that TV screen as your box. That's how we're going to solve these issues. So I'm talking to this military consultant, we're talking about all these issues, and then I ask him, well, you know, even though the economy of Michigan is in a shambles, you must be doing very well. You're a military consultant. Of course, President Obama is expanding the war in Afghanistan. He said, yes, the military is doing well. The military contractors, the military consultants are doing well. But he looked troubled. He said, but I am baffled. And I said, why? And he said, because I'm an American. And I can't for the life of me understand why he's expanding the war. And you're a military consultant. He said, you know, you look at the terrain in Afghanistan. He was getting very technical, comparing it to Iraq. And then he said, and just look at the history. This war is unwinnable. This was a military consultant who was saying this. I said, is that what other military consultants feel? People you talk to, military contractors, people in the Pentagon? He said, oh, of course, we talk about this all the time. Why aren't these voices heard? Yes, the conventional peace movement, but also people high up in the military, people in intelligence. It's just like the lead up to Iraq, where all of those people, as well as UN weapons inspectors, we were broadcasting these people all the time, saying the evidence doesn't add up. Where are these voices? And that's what is important for people in this country to demand, to start off by making your demands of the media, because that shapes so much of what we do. As Noam Chomsky says, the media manufactures consent for war. By the way, speaking of Noam Chomsky, as we travel the country, we are able to bring out the voices of people of every community. That's part of the exhilaration of the 70-city tour. So tomorrow when we're at PBS here, we'll be talking about issues in Montana. But every community, we do this. And when we were in Boston, well, Noam Chomsky came in, and we did this 2-hour interview, 1 hour on the air, 1 hour off, and then we played the second hour the next week. He's a global figure, this political dissident, world-renowned linguist, who many of you have heard if you listen to or watch Democracy Now! But he also lives in a particular place, and it is Boston. So we have some of the DVDs of the full 2 hours. Nicole, who was arrested at the convention, she edited the tape just to put it all together, and we're offering you that. If you get 2 copies of Standing Up to the Madness, and why would you do that? This last book, well, think birthday, Mother's Day, Father's Day, give it to a library, someone's graduation. Oh, by the way, we hit number 17 on the New York Times bestseller list, which is wonderful, because otherwise they'd never mention it. Guess who's 16? Barack Obama. Okay, which brings us to November 4th, the day the world heaved a sigh of relief. I mean, this was not just a national election. This was a global event. And Barack Obama is a global figure. His father is a black Kenyan man, his mother a white woman from Kansas. He's born in Hawaii, raised partly in Indonesia, then sent back to be raised by his maternal grandparents in Hawaii, goes to Occidental College in California, then graduates from Columbia University, then goes to be a community organizer on the south side of Chicago. Then he becomes the first black president of the Harvard Law Review, then goes back to community organizing, and well, you know the rest. He becomes the first African-American president of the United States. Just think. Parents all over this country are saying to their kids right now, maybe you could be a community organizer too. Well, and I'm not talking partisan politics. You know, history was made, whatever your politics, Republican, Democrat, Green, Independent, history was made that day. And it is extremely significant with this country, with its legacy of slavery. Extremely significant. I was interviewing the Pan-Africanist thinker, the professor at Binghamton University, Ali Masri. I said, you know, he's the first African-American president of the United States. He said, oh, come on, it's more than that. He's the first black president of the Western world. He said it might start a trend, like the first black president of France, or the first black prime minister of Britain, or maybe the first black chancellor of Germany. He said, actually, that's least likely. But, you know, so significant. And then the day that the Obamas went into the White House, before the inauguration, they were meeting with the Bushes. And I remember that day because CNN invited me on that afternoon, Rick Sanchez, to talk about the significance. And so there's all sorts of talk among the guests on the air, and then they asked me a question about whatever it was they were talking about, but I'm looking at the video screen and the Obamas are actually walking into the White House. And I said, wait a second, we have to take pause. Barack Hussein Obama, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama. Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama, her grandfather comes from South Carolina. He migrated up in the Great Migration to Chicago, where he settled. She is the descendant of slaves, so their children, Sasha and Malia, are the descendant of slaves. And they will now reside in the White House, the most famous house on earth built by slaves. Can President Obama redeem the White House? It's really not up to him. It's up to all of you. I think for a long time now, people have felt they are hitting their heads against brick walls, and some are having their heads hit against brick walls, as has become very clear in the release of the torture memos this week. It's called walling. But I think people have felt that they've been hitting their heads against a brick wall for a long time. I think that wall is now a door, and that door is open a crack. And the question is, will it be kicked open or slammed shut? That's up to you. You look at how Barack Obama won. He galvanized millions of new voters, young people, 67% of Latinos, 95% of African Americans, 70% of single women seem to be a new voting bloc, recognized as such, voted for Barack Obama. And what about the money? You know, it's our job as journalists to follow the money. Well, he opted out of public financing of campaigns, an enormous problem in this country, the level to which politics marinate in money, are swamped by money, are determined by money, are corrupted by money. He raised more money, he spent more money than any candidate in the history of this country. Millions and millions of dollars. How was that raised? Well, the good news is millions and millions of people gave small amounts of money. That's very encouraging. Or didn't give money at all, just really put their effort into electing him. But then there's that small circle of people who gave millions, small circle of people and corporations who gave millions. The question is, who wins out? Those who are used to walking the halls of power, used to walking through the West Wing, or all of those other people, the great majority. When those who are used to enjoying power whisper in his ear in the White House they want something done, if he can't look out the window and point and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille, if there's no one out there, he's in trouble. But it's not only necessarily to support him. You may disagree with him in big ways. And how are you going to make your voices heard when the community organizer-in-chief becomes the commander-in-chief and you have to do your own community organizing? You can actually take a lesson from him, a lesson he referred to, but I'll tell it to you in a roundabout way. You know when they took that train ride from Philadelphia, retracing the steps of Abraham Lincoln? Or the train ride of Abraham Lincoln on the way to the inauguration, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore. Abraham Lincoln had to be spirited through Baltimore because Maryland was a secessionist state and they thought he would be killed on the way to Washington. The Obamas went on Saturday before the inauguration. It was Michelle Obama's 45th birthday. The train ride, it is so symbolic, the train ride, in many ways. It made me think of A. Philip Randolph, the great community organizer, civil rights leader. And if you're a student, write a paper on him. If you don't know about him and you're older, investigate. He was the organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, and he was the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, you know, the conductors, black conductors on the Pullman trains. And as we drove from Spokane this morning, we passed Pullman, Washington, named for George Pullman. The Pullman companies, yes, they were the largest employer of black men in the 20s and 30s, something, I think it was something like up to 20,000 black men. They were all called George because of George Pullman, so you can see why they needed to union organize. And on the night of this inauguration, I went to a peace ball that was held in the Postal Museum next to Union Station, and Harry Belafonte was there as well. And I got a chance to ask him about this story I had heard about. Well, Harry Belafonte was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt told him about bringing A. Philip Randolph to the White House to meet with FDR. And A. Philip Randolph described to FDR the condition of black people in this country, why people needed to organize, the condition of workers in this country. FDR listened intently and then said, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but you'll have to make me do it. Make me do it. Interestingly, about a year and a half ago, Barack Obama, when it wasn't clear he was going to win, when he was senator running for president, was in the backyard of a Montclair, New Jersey house, about, oh, I don't know, 150 people there. He was raising money. He was answering questions, and he was just about to run out. He said, I'll take one more question. A man stood up and said, what about the Middle East? What about, Israel, Palestine, Gaza, West Bank? What about this situation? And Barack Obama repeated the story of A. Philip Randolph meeting with FDR and answered by quoting FDR, make me do it. See, it's about movements. That's what makes the difference in this country. No one can do it alone. Which brings me to a house that's not so far from the White House. It's a couple of hours away. It's on the eastern shore of Maryland. That's where Frederick Douglass was born. Frederick Douglass, the greatest abolitionist in U.S. history, born in the eastern shore of Maryland. He was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. And it might not surprise you to know he was a troublesome slave. And so he was handed to a slave breaker, a man named Edwin Covey. His property was called Mount Misery. And Frederick Douglass was beaten there. Frederick Douglass was tortured there. But he fought back and ultimately he broke away and he headed north. I go to this little coffee shop, an independent coffee shop in New York, in this old brick building, and there is a plaque on the outside that says Frederick Douglass first took refuge here when he came to New York. It was the printing press of David Ruggles, who was born a free black man in Connecticut. He was one of the conductors of the Underground Railroad. By the way, I see independent media as the Underground Railroad of information. But he was the conductor of the Underground Railroad. He helped bring Frederick Douglass north. And I think it's so interesting that these men, fighting for the freedom of whole populations, saw the media as their means of liberation. David Ruggles' printing press, Frederick Douglass started the North Star newspaper. The idea that information is power. So back to the eastern shore of Maryland and Mount Misery, where Frederick Douglass was beaten. That property today is owned by Donald Rumsfeld. It is his vacation home. He bought it in 2003 to be near his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. It's where Donald Rumsfeld relaxes, Mount Misery. Now, I learned of this. I read about it. I researched it. I didn't just single source it, I double sourced it, I triple sourced it. You know, I did what a journalist should do. And I really combed the internet. And by the way, we have to make sure, just like with public radio and television, remains public and open, equal access for all. We have to ensure the same thing for the internet. We can't let the telecoms and the cable companies write the legislation that'll privatize the internet. It's called preserving network neutrality. It's a buzzword. I think there's a problem with it because no one knows what it means, but we do know what it means to be able to communicate freely on the internet, to speak with people all over the world. It's the answer to corporate globalization. It's grassroots globalization. We have to ensure every step of the way in every platform of media that we all have open access to it. But the internet can also be a global rumor mill, and you have to be very careful, and especially students here. You can't just say that, well, it was the printed word. You have to question everything, and you have to really check things out. So that's what we did. I thought, I really have to see this with my own eyes, and so we went to St. Michael's. I was there with Dennis Moynihan, who is the organizer of this very arduous and crazy 70-city tour, but he's really the reason so much of Democracy Now! Has grown. He was the outreach director of Democracy Now! For so long. He's probably handing out your Daily Digest list tonight. So we drove to St. Michael's on the eastern shore of Maryland. And I realized when I got there, oh my God, I have no idea where the Secretary of Defense lives. If he lives here, how am I going to find out? And then I see an organic coffee shop ahead of me. You can see a theme in my life. And I think they'll tell the truth. So I went inside. And they said, what would you like? I said, I'd like to know where the Secretary of Defense lives. And they said, oh, just go out back, drive down the road. You'll hit Mount Pleasant Road. Don't go down that road. You make a right, and then you make another right, and that's Mount Misery Road. You go to the end of that, and you'll find Donald Rumsfeld. So we went out back, we drove down the road. We did not go down Mount Pleasant Road. We made that turn on Mount Misery Road. We're heading down the road. I see the black tinted windows of the SUV of the Secret Service, and I know we have arrived. So I get out of the car slowly, I take out my little video camera, and I start zooming in as they're zooming out. And I'm filming, I'm thinking, does Donald Rumsfeld understand the significance of this place where he lives, the history of this? Well, make no mistake about it. As I'm zooming in, I see a stake in the ground right next to the driveway. It says Mount Misery. So I head over to an old black church. It's Sunday morning. The folks are about to have Mass. They're sitting in the sanctuary, and I go up to a woman, an older woman. I said, this is just amazing, the significance of the place you live. I mean, Frederick Douglass was born here. He was beaten here. He was enslaved here, and the property is Donald Rumsfeld's. What do you think of this? And she said, I can't comment right now. We're in church. From Mount Misery to Mount Hope. When I was speaking recently in Geneva, New York, right near Rochester, where I'd flown in, a young woman came up to me afterwards, and she said, do you know that you're right near where Frederick Douglass is buried? He's buried in Rochester at Mount Hope Cemetery, and she offered to take me there. I was leaving it very early in the morning to fly to Denver. It was the middle of a snowstorm. I said, well, if you'd meet me at the gates at 5, I'd like to go with you. And that's exactly what she did. She met me at the gates, and we trudged through the snow, and we found the tombstone. We brushed off the snow, and it was amazing. And then she got a twinkle in her eye, and she said, would you like to come with me across the cemetery? I'd like to show you something else. I said, I really can't miss my flight. She said, oh, please. So we started to walk, and then we started to jog, and then to run, and then I was sprinting. And we made it to the other end of the cemetery. Who is buried there but Susan B. Anthony? the great suffragists, the great women's rights activists. You know that Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass were not only close allies, they were close friends. And when I was speaking last week in Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, a woman came up to me after and said, and did you go to Susan B. Anthony's house near there? And did you see the statue near there? The statue, not of a military general on horseback, but a sculpture of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony having tea together. Susan B. Anthony not only was a women's rights activist, she was also an anti-slavery activist, and Frederick Douglass was also a feminist and a women's rights activist. He went to the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention for the Rights of Women. These are the movements that have made this country great. So I raced off to the airport and missed my plane. So I called Dennis quickly, Well, first I called the people in Denver, and I tried to explain to them it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. They weren't buying it. So I called Dennis. I said, you have to get me on the next plane. This isn't funny. And so he pulls up the airport on the internet, and he says, okay, which terminal are you in? Frederick Douglass Terminal or Susan B. Anthony? I said, oh, come on, I can't fool around right now. I need to know what is the next plane. He said, I'm not kidding. I'm looking at the blueprints of the airport. I said, what? I know every single airport in this country. Okay, maybe I didn't know, when was it, Sunday, when we flew from Silver City to Albuquerque? Whoa, that was a small plane. The flight attendant was also the co-pilot. I made sure not to order any drinks, just sit right there. But I do know every airport, I think, in this country. And that one, so I'm saying, what do you mean? So I walk to the middle of the airport. There's two wings. And sure enough, there's a little plaque on one that says Susan B. Anthony, and the other, in the ground, it says Frederick Douglass. You have to stop and smell the flowers sometime, or smell the coffee in my case. So anyway, I'm thinking, which terminal do I go next? Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass. Okay, I went down both, I got my plane, I went to Denver. But these movements, and the equivalent today, is the media broadcasting the voices of people who don't just work alone, come out of nowhere. They come out of movements and inspire movements. When I was in Cambridge speaking at the Cambridge Forum, I don't know if it was yesterday or last week, but afterwards, just like Fact or Fiction, the independent bookstore there is called the Harvard Bookstore. So we work with them, and then afterwards I went over, because we were interviewing Chomsky the next morning, I needed some Chomsky books, and he said they don't have any, although they had one, he said, but it was just stolen. I thought no one would appreciate this. But the owner of the bookstore then said, you just interviewed, or you recently interviewed my son's girlfriend. Who was that? Her name was Mari Oy, and I certainly remembered her. She was a few years ago, high school senior. She'd come on Democracy Now! With Leah Anthony Librescu. They were two presidential scholars of 150. Each year, these kids are chosen around the country, good grades, good extracurricular activities, and they get chosen, I think, 3 in a state, and they get chosen to go to Washington, D.C. and meet the President of the United States. So it's a very big deal. So this was a few years ago. So they were meeting President George W. Bush. And the night before their meeting, Mari gets to thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to get to do something that people all over the world would like to do, and that's have a few words with the president. And she's thinking, what is she going to do? So she stays up all night with other presidential scholars, and they decide to write a letter. And 50 of them, a third of the presidential scholars, sign it. Now, Leah Anthony Librescu is very nervous because she's thinking, what if it gets confiscated? So she handwrites it all over, and she puts it up her sleeve. Beware of smart students with something up their sleeve. So they head to the Rose Garden. I think they met in the Rose Garden. And the president gives them a lecture, and he says to them, the decisions you make today will affect the way the rest of your lives turn out. That was Mari's cue. She said, well then, Mr. President, we've decided to give you this letter. And she hands him the letter. This is just adorable, right? This high school senior is giving the president a letter, and he's putting it in his pocket, and he's smiling. And he says, wait, would you like me to read this? And so she said, well, that would be your decision. And so he's smiling, and he looks down, he opens the letter, and he's not smiling anymore. And he looks up, and he says, we do not torture. And he looks down, he keeps reading, he looks up, we do not torture. So Mari says to him something like, well, then will you unsign the signing statement you signed when you signed the McCain anti-torture bill? What was she talking about? You know what a signing statement is? Well, President Bush has signed more than all presidents in the history of the country combined. What a signing statement is, the president signs a bill that is passed by Congress with great fanfare, and then quietly signs a signing statement that says he doesn't have to abide by it. So President Bush signed more than 1,100 of them. So that's why Mari Oy said to the president, well, then will you unsign the signing statement you signed when you signed the McCain anti-torture bill? And then a boy from Montana, I believe, one of the presidential scholars from here, raised his hand and said something like, we don't have to represent torture to the rest of the world. So that was their meeting with the President of the United States. And the parents weren't there, but they were in Washington, so I should say Leah, who still has that letter up her sleeve. Well, she still has it because the other wasn't confiscated, so she hands it to the press, and that's how information got out. But Mari calls her mom, who's in the last room of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and she starts to cry, her mother, and she walks out into the sunlight, tears streaming down her face, because Mari did something that she had wanted to do 40 years ago. She, too, was a presidential scholar, and she had wanted to tell President Johnson to stop the war in Vietnam. But her favorite teacher told her it wasn't the time or place, so she remained quiet. And Mari, her daughter, broke her mother's silence as well. And to add impetus to what Mari did, her grandparents were interned in the Japanese internment camps of World War II. Leah Anthony Librescu, well, her parents named her that. She was named for Susan B. Anthony. Her parents taught her well, and these kids teach us well. They are the hope, which is why in Standing Up to the Madness, we have a chapter called Voices in Conflict about other kids in a public high school in Connecticut called Wilton High. And they decided to do their annual play about the war, and they took the statements of soldiers as well as letters soldiers had written home, and they wove them together. They did it with their drama teacher, Bonnie Dickinson, and they were going to perform their annual play, making the costumes, learning their lines, until the principal came in and said, you will not perform this play on the Wilton High stage. And the kids said, why? It's our annual play. We do one every year. And he said, because war is too controversial. Well, when they begged, they pleaded, they were angry. He said that ship has sailed, and it sailed them right onto the New York stage because New York theaters heard about the censorship, and these kids ended up doing what actors dream of all their lives, to perform on the New York stage. Before hundreds of theatergoers, most poignant were the soldiers in the audience who were watching their own words dramatized for the first time. When the story got big and the New York Times wrote an article about it, Ira Levin, the late playwright, wrote a letter to the Times, and he congratulated the kids. He said, he wrote The Stepford Wives, and he said he grew up in Wilton, Connecticut, and Stepford Wives was based on his experience there. He congratulated the kids for not being Stepfordized. Well, I'm going to stay in Connecticut now, because that's another chapter of our book. Well, it's about a group of people you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley if you were violating someone's civil liberties, and they are the librarians of this country. Are there any librarians in the audience? Okay, I see I'm in tough company here. It's about the librarians of Central Connecticut who run the internet system. More and more people are using libraries now in these very economically difficult times, and particularly using the internet. And so it's an important resource. And it's called the Library Connection, a nonprofit that runs the 27 libraries' internet connection. The executive director was named George Christian, and one day he gets a knock at the door. It's 2 FBI agents, and they're demanding to know information about people who use the internet at a certain time on a certain day. And they do that by handing George Christian an NSL, that's a national security letter. Getting one of these is like being exposed to radioactivity. You are then contaminated. You cannot tell a soul that you have been handed this letter. Hundreds of thousands of them have been given out. Maybe someone in this audience has gotten one, but you can tell no one. You can't tell your partner, you can't tell a coworker, you can't tell your boss on pain of 5 years in prison. It's that serious. So he's reading the letter through his bifocals, and he's looking up. And he sees it's asking about information about his patrons, about the people who use the library system. And he looks up at the FBI agency, says, I believe this is unconstitutional. They look at him pityingly, like predators sizing up their prey. And they hand him their cards and they say, you get back to us. George Christian closes the door. This brave librarian crumples in his chair and he thinks, oh my God, what am I going to do? He doesn't even know he can call a lawyer. And he thinks, if I am going to take on the whole national security state, I need at least 3 other librarians. And so he calls the executive committee at great risk of the library connection, like they're directors of other libraries in Connecticut. He calls Peter Chase. He's head of the Plainville Library. He's the library director. We went to interview him in central Connecticut. He's the one, we could tell he's the library director. He's the one with the plastic pocket protector. So he calls Peter and he says, you've got to come quickly. We've got to have an appointment. We have to have a meeting at the Library Connection office. You are not to tell anyone where you're going. You won't be able to tell anyone what I tell you. You won't be able to tell anyone where you were. And do you have the next month's clear on your calendar? Peter Chase is saying, what is he talking about? First of all, he had just gotten this job, the vice president of the Library Connection, a lofty title for a volunteer job. They said to him it would be easy. So he's racing off in his car, and he's thinking, what could possibly be an emergency of the Library Connection? Did someone misfile an adult book in the children's section? So he gets to the offices. The other librarians are there, and the pro bono lawyer. George Christian closes the door, exposes them all to the NSL. They are all now gagged and muzzled. But they do agree they're not going to give over this information. I mean, the pro bono lawyer said, this is way over my pay grade, you've got to call the ACLU, and she ran out. And they did call the ACLU, and they decided to sue the US government and try to take down the USA Patriot Act under which this letter was served. This case of John Doe, Connecticut, they became the John Doe, Connecticut librarians. No one could know who they were. Started to get increasingly bizarre. They're supposed to show up, well, the case is being heard in a Bridgeport court, but they're told they can't show up because they are threats to national security. So they are brought to a Hartford court a couple hours away, and a security guard locks them in a closet. No one more surprised than the security guard, who doesn't usually lock librarians in a closet. But because there's a closed-circuit TV inside the closet where they're looking at the Bridgeport court, and what was so moving to them is they're looking out like I'm looking at you over the shoulder of the judge, and they see this courtroom packed with librarians from all over the region. The librarians didn't know who these particular librarians were, but they knew they didn't want them to stand alone. And then the case just kept getting crazier. The government forgot to redact Peter Chase's name in some documents that they released, and so his name got known, and reporters were calling his house, and this kid runs out one day when he comes home from the library. He says, like, Dad, a reporter called to sing about the FBI and a court case. Like, are you involved with drugs? Your typical father-son conversation. And he says, son, you did not get that call. You are not to repeat that. And then he goes inside and he's calling his lawyer. These happen over time. And he's saying, reporters are calling me. I'm hanging up on the New York Times. They say, are you John Doe, Connecticut? And I know I can't reveal this. And yet it's the government that revealed my name. I didn't reveal it. And he's just chuckling. And the lawyer is not smiling. The lawyer, I should say, is not chuckling on the phone. He says, Peter, I advise that you leave your house. The government doesn't know if you called them or they called you or if you revealed information. Leave your house, and you shouldn't stay in any one place for more than a few nights. Now these librarians are gag muzzled and on the run. Well, eventually, they had wanted to testify before Congress against the USA Patriot Act. When it was being renewed, they couldn't. They were muzzled. But when the USA Patriot Act was renewed, after a few weeks, their gag was lifted. And they're the only 4 people in the country who can talk about having been served with an NSL. Oh, there's one more person. His name is Brewster Kahle. I just met him in San Francisco. He is the digital librarian extraordinaire. He runs the Internet Archive, archive.org. It is the entire digital archive of the Internet, not just today, but for all time. You can go to archive.org in the Wayback Machine and look at anyone's website way, way back. It's all archived there. And he was served with an NSL. And he posted it online. So those are the only 5 people. And they are the freedom fighters of our time. Just like another they're called Librarians Unbound, and other chapters on the global warming scientists who weren't political, they were just trained as scientists, but then they find that global warming, the words are being vacuumed off government websites. That's our chapter, Some Don't Like It Hot. And then we have a chapter on psychologists. I'm not going to go into that now. It's called Psychologists in Denial. I know some of you are psychologists, and maybe some of you have gone to psychologists, but it is about the American Psychological Association, largest association of psychologists in the world, and how it refused over and over to pass a ban on its members participating in coercive interrogations, which we now understand are torture. And this is very relevant this week. In fact, we just wrote the column today. I do a weekly column. Your local newspaper can run it. I just went yesterday to the Spokesman Review. They're one of the papers that runs the column, and we did it out of Spokane because there is a company of psychologists there called Mitchell, Jessen, and Associates, who are really the pioneers of the torture practices at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. It's in the downtown American Legion Hall. Their offices, 120 or so employees. It's a remarkable story. They train at Fairchild Air Force Base, where they reverse engineered the SEER program. You know, SEER is a reasonable program. It's about how you train soldiers in case they're captured somewhere, to resist, to evade, to escape, to survive. And that is a reasonable program for soldiers in the world. But what they've done is they have reverse engineered it, and they used it against prisoners at Guantanamo, you know, naked, walling, throwing them against walls, sleeplessness, overall torture. And the American Psychological Association refused to pass a ban on their members participating in these interrogations. The American Medical Association passed a ban, the American Psychiatric Association passed a ban, but not the APA. So a group of dissident psychologists took on their own association, and though they couldn't buck the leadership, they figured out a way to pass a referendum to the membership, and they overwhelmingly voted for the ban. That's that chapter, but I'm going to end with the story of Rosa Parks. And then, by the way, I am very happy to talk to each and every one of you, whether you're coming up to get books signed or you just want to come up and say hi. Why Rosa Parks and why end there? Yes, she was a remarkable woman, but most of you know her story, except maybe you don't, because the media even gets that story wrong. Rosa Parks, December 1st, 1955, sits down the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. In so doing, she stands up for all of us, because if any of us are diminished, we are all diminished. She refuses to get up for a white passenger. That night, Joanne Robinson, another activist and educator, mimeographs 35,000 leaflets to start the Montgomery bus boycott. Does anyone know that word anymore? Mimeograph? It's like the modern day I am or tweet, right? And then 4 days later, when Rosa goes to court, the Montgomery Improvement Association has their mass meeting, and they choose as their leader a young minister who's just come into town. His name is Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helps to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. And we just passed on April 4th, the 41st anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. Remember, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. We went there and saw the blood still stains the cement there on that balcony. It's preserved as a museum. The night before he was killed, at the Mason Temple in Memphis was a large gathering. He'd gone to Memphis to march with the sanitation workers for them to organize, holding those placards, "I am a man." He was driven out by violence before. His inner circle said, "Don't go back, you face too much threat." He said, "If I can't stand with them, what hope do they have?" So he did go back, but he wasn't feeling well on April 3rd. He sends Ralph Abernathy, Reverend Abernathy, to see the folks at Mason Temple. Reverend Abernathy calls him and says, "Martin, they don't want me, they want you. You got to get over here." So he goes to the Mason Temple. And I was speaking to a man who said he was a kid at the time. He was a punk in the streets, and his dad said, "Get over to Mason Temple and hear Dr. King." He said he will never forget the staccato sound of the stiletto heels of the women as Dr. King came in, and the rain pounding on the Mason Temple roof, packed with hundreds of people, and Dr. King gave that unforgettable mountaintop address. Within a day, he would be dead. April 4th, 1968. Well, a year to the day before he was killed, on April 4th, 1967, he was giving another speech at Riverside Church in New York. That was his speech opposed to the war in Vietnam. It's not as famous as the 1963 I Have a Dream speech or the mountaintop address. unless you listen to Democracy Now! Or watch it. And you can go back to democracynow.org and you can see it. We run it every Dr. King birthday. His Beyond Vietnam speech. Again, his inner circle said, Martin, don't do it. Don't take on the war. It's not your war, the war in Vietnam. Your war is here at home. Your war is the war on poverty. Your war is the war on racism. You have an ally in the White House. You got Johnson to sign the Civil Rights Act. You got him to sign the Voting Rights Act. Don't alienate him. But Dr. King said no, that his wars, that these wars were all connected. The war on racism, the war on poverty, the war on militarism. He said the war in Vietnam, if he cared about black and brown babies at home, he cared about them everywhere, not to mention white children as well. And so he spoke out. It was a powerful address. It rocked the Riverside Church as thousands packed in. And when I was just speaking recently, a woman came and said, I was there in the front row of the balcony. For young people here who think it may be easy, it's really hard for us to organize today. It's easy for those people back then because they were hailed as heroes. Everyone respected them. It's not so easy to do it today. That's not true. He was vilified for this address. Time magazine called it demagogic slander, read like a script out of Radio Hanoi. Washington Post said he had done a disservice to his mission, his cause, his people. But he just kept on speaking out until that year later in Memphis, Tennessee. Going back to Rosa Parks, when she died a few years ago, we rushed to Washington. She was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Then her body was brought to a Washington church. Thousands turned out, inside and outside. Inside, Oprah was there, Cicely Tyson was there. Outside, there were loudspeakers. I interviewed a young woman, a college student, who said she emailed her professors that morning. She said, I won't be in class, I'm going to get an education. Any of you students, I didn't say that to you. There was a 91-year-old African-American woman who said she had sat down in the bus 14 years before Rosa and refused to get up for a white passenger. Not in the South, in the North, in Salem, Massachusetts. Other women had sat down in the bus and in Montgomery before Rosa did and refused to get up. Rosa Parks sat down in the bus before Rosa did on December 1st, 1955, and refused to get up. But December 1st was the magic moment, and you never can predict when that moment comes. But if you are involved in building a foundation, then you can help determine history. You can help determine the future when that moment happens. And the way the media got it wrong is when she died, they said, Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. Rosa Parks was a world-class troublemaker. She was the local secretary of the NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. In fact, he was one of the organizers of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. They had been working to challenge the racist laws in the South for years. She had trained at the Highlander Center. We just passed there last week in Tennessee, where white and black together work to, most effectively strategize to change the world. And that's also where the media gets it wrong. They denigrate activists. But what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? And to show how brave Rosa was, just go back a few months in 1955 to the summer. Emmett Till, 14-year-old boy, African-American. His mom, Mamie Till, they live in Chicago, sends him to Money, Mississippi for a few weeks in the summer to get out of the city. He's with his uncle and aunt and his cousins. He's sleeping late at night, and a white mob comes, rips him out of bed. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman, and he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body is dredged up and sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, does something incredibly courageous. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands streamed by his casket and saw, and then Jet magazine and other black publications took photographs, and they were published. and they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures, show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? For just 1 week, above the fold of all the surviving newspapers, photograph and articles, top news story in every newscast, radio and television, every day for 1 week. The babies dead on the ground, the women with their legs blown up by cluster bombs from Iraq to Afghanistan, the soldiers dead and dying. For just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy Now!
Well, it was worth the wait, that's what I have to say. I want to say thank you to MCAT for airing Democracy Now! For us every day here in Missoula, 6 and 10 a.m. I also want to say that we're very hopeful still. There's a local Missoula community radio group that's working to bring a broadcast license here to Missoula so that more people can hear Democracy Now! And so we're still hopeful, and if you want to help and be part of that, you can call the Peace Center, and we've got some more information on that. MCAT is filming this today, and so if you are interested in maybe getting a DVD of Amy's talk tonight, you can get call the Peace Center or MCAT. Thanks to Fact and Fiction for helping to sponsor tonight. They have books over here. All of Amy's books are for sale, and Amy is over here willing to sign them and talk to folks. 2 books, remember, if you buy 2 of Standing Up to the Madness, you'll get a free DVD of Noam Chomsky. So I don't know about you, but I think it'd make a great gift. So thanks for coming, thanks for supporting, and thank you, Amy.
Rose, I was named after a flower. My life's been far from holy. I'm 17 and I got a baby. A lot of people can tell me.
I love Amy. Thank you, Amy. This was really great. Thank you, Jeanette Rankin Peace Center.
You're a little girl, that's not the worst thing in the world. Gotta grow up someday. It's made me wonder.
Thanks, Amy.
Why things are the way they are, why some people starve every day, while some are so rich they're throwing money away. Well, I think about my own mom. She worked hard all her life, and she had to fight for every step she made. We used to be on food stamps, and I hated going to the store, 'cause people either stared at us